The fluorescent lights in Dr. Chan's office hummed with an intensity that seemed to match the buzzing in Maya's ears. She sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching the doctor's lips, moved but struggling to process the words that were reshaping her entire future. Systemic lupus erythematosus, Dr. Chan repeated gently, her kind eyes filled with professional compassion. It's an autoimmune condition where your body's immune system attacks healthy tissue. The joint pain, the fatigue, the rashes you've been experiencing, they're all connected. Maya nodded mechanically, though nothing felt connected anymore. For months, she had bounced between doctors, each one offering different theories, different tests, different hopes. Some had suggested stress. Others had mentioned vitamin deficiencies. Her mother had insisted it was just the pressure of being a newlywed and a high school English teacher. What does this mean for my life? Maya's voice came out smaller than she intended, almost childlike. Dr. Chun leaned forward slightly, her expression softening even more. Lupus is unpredictable. Some days will be better than others. You'll need to make significant lifestyle changes, reduce stress, avoid sun exposure, take medications that will help manage the symptoms. Teaching might become challenging during flare-ups. The word flare-ups hit Maya like a physical blow. She had always been the person others relied on, the teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, the daughter who never missed a family gathering, the wife who had energy for evening walks with Arjun after long days. Now she was being told her body was at war with itself. Will I be able to have children? The question slipped out before Maya could stop it, though it had been lurking in her mind since the moment Dr. Chun had started explaining. It's possible, but pregnancy with lupus requires careful monitoring. We'd need to adjust medications, and there would be increased risks. Dr. Chun's voice remained steady, but Maya could hear the caution threaded through her words. Maya stared at the medical degree hanging on the wall behind Dr. Chan's desk, its gold frame catching the harsh office lighting. She thought about the conversation she and Arjun had just last week about converting their spare bedroom into a nursery. They had been married for 8 months, and the topic of children had begun weaving itself into their daily conversations with increasing frequency. I know this is overwhelming, Dr. Chun continued, sliding a packet of information across the desk. But lupus doesn't mean your life is over. Many people live full, meaningful lives with this condition. There are support groups, treatment options that improve quality of life significantly. Maya picked up the packet, its weight somehow heavier than it should have been. The cover featured a smiling woman in her 30s, probably meant to represent hope and resilience. Instead, Maya felt like she was looking at a stranger, someone she might become, but couldn't imagine being. As she walked to her car in the medical center parking lot, Maya felt disconnected from her own body. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, something that usually filled her with joy as it marked the beginning of her favorite teaching season. Now it felt like an ending. She sat in her car for 20 minutes before starting the engine, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror and wondering who this person with lupus was supposed to be. Silent Storm's Maya's phone buzzed for the 15th time that afternoon, Arjun's name lighting up the screen like a persistent reminder of the life she could no longer inhabit. She let it go to voicemail again, pulling the blanket higher over her head as she lay on their living room couch, surrounded by the detritus of her new reality, empty teacups, unopened mail, and the lupus information packet Dr. Chun had given her 3 weeks ago. The apartment felt different now, as if the diagnosis had changed the very air she breathed. Sunlight streaming through their bedroom window, once a source of morning joy, now felt like a threat. Dr. Chun had explained photosensitivity, how UV rays could trigger flare-ups, but Maya hadn't expected the psychological weight of viewing Something as basic as sunshine as an enemy. She had called in sick to Jefferson High School for 12 consecutive days now, each morning bringing a fresh wave of guilt as she listened to her own voice on the answering machine, claiming she was under the weather. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was drowning in weather she couldn't escape, a storm system that had taken residence in her own bones and joints. Principal Rodriguez had been understanding at first, even sending flowers with a note that read, "Take all the time you need to recover." But Maya knew that understanding had limits, especially when her substitute teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was struggling to manage her advanced placement literature classes. Her students were preparing for college entrance essays, and she was abandoning them at the most crucial time of the academic year. The worst part wasn't the physical symptoms, though the joint pain had been particularly brutal this week. It was the way she felt like she was disappearing from her own life. Yesterday, she had stood in the bathroom mirror for 20 minutes, studying her face for signs of the butterfly rash Dr. Chun had mentioned. When she couldn't find it, she felt almost disappointed, as if she needed visible proof of her invisible struggle. Arjun's key turned in the lock at 6:15, exactly when he arrived every evening since this nightmare began. Maya closed her eyes, pretending to sleep, listening to his careful footsteps as he moved through their home, like he was navigating around broken glass. "Maya?" His voice was soft, hopeful. "I brought dinner from Priya's kitchen, the dal you like." She kept her breathing steady, though the smell of cumin and coriander made her stomach growl with the first hunger she'd felt in days. She heard him set the containers on their kitchen counter, then the familiar sound of him settling into his reading chair across the room. This had become their evening routine. Arjun would bring food, Maya would pretend to sleep, and they would exist in the same space while occupying completely different worlds. She knew he was studying her face in the dim light, probably trying to decode what was happening to his wife, the woman who used to greet him at the door with stories about her students and plans for their weekend. "The Johnsons next door asked about you today," Arjun said quietly. "Mrs. Johnson wanted to know if you'd like her to water your herb garden." Maya's herb garden. Another casualty she hadn't fully processed. The small collection of basil, mint, and cilantro plants she had nurtured on their apartment balcony now sat wilting in the October sun, neglected like everything else she used to care about. The thought of Mrs. Johnson's well-meaning concern made Maya's chest tight with shame. Through her closed eyelids, she sensed Arjun moving closer. The couch dipped slightly as he sat on the edge, and she felt his hand hover over her shoulder without making contact, as if he was afraid she might break under even the gentlest touch. "I don't know what's happening," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly, "but I'm here. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." Maya's throat burned with unshed tears. The word "together" felt like a promise she could no longer keep, a future she had no right to offer him. How could she explain that lupus wasn't just changing her body, but rewriting the fundamental story of who she was supposed to be? When Arjun finally went to bed at 11, Maya opened her eyes to the darkness and wondered how long a person could live in the space between their old life and whatever came next. The gathering Arjun stared at the medical bill that had arrived in their mailbox that Tuesday morning, Maya's name printed clearly next to words that made his blood run cold. Systemic lupus erythematosus, initial consultation. The date matched exactly with the day Maya had claimed to have a routine dentist appointment, the day she had returned home hollow-eyed and unreachable. He sat at their kitchen table, a paper trembling slightly in his hands as 3 weeks of confusion suddenly crystallized into heartbreaking clarity. Maya's withdrawal, her sudden resignation from teaching, the way she flinched when he tried to touch her, it all made terrible sense now. She wasn't just pulling away from him. She was drowning, and she had been drowning alone. That evening, after Maya had retreated to their bedroom, claiming exhaustion, Arjun opened his laptop and began researching with the same methodical intensity he brought to his work as a software engineer. He read medical journals, patient testimonials, and support group forums until his eyes burned. By 3 in the morning, he understood that lupus wasn't just a diagnosis. It was a complete reorganization of how a person moved through the world. But it was a blog post by a woman named Sarah from Portland that changed everything. She had written about the isolation that came with chronic illness, how shame could become more debilitating than the physical symptoms. The hardest part wasn't learning to live with lupus, she had written. It was remembering that I was still worth loving. Arjun closed the laptop and looked toward their bedroom, where Maya lay curled away from him, even in sleep. An idea began forming, crazy and ambitious, but rooted in everything he knew about his wife's heart. The next morning, after Maya had fallen, back asleep following another restless night, Arjun called Jefferson High School and asked to speak with Principal Rodriguez. "I need contact information for some of Maya's former students," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "It's for a surprise." Principal Rodriguez was hesitant at first, citing privacy policies, but something in Arjun's tone must have conveyed the gravity of the situation. "Maya's been one of our most beloved teachers for 5 years," she said finally. "If this will help her, I'll see what I can do." By Thursday, Arjun had compiled a list of 23 named students Maya had tutored, colleagues she had mentored, neighbors whose children she had helped with homework. He spent his lunch breaks making phone calls, his evenings writing emails, explaining his plan with a desperation that surprised him. "Maya doesn't know that I know about her diagnosis," he told each person. "She's been carrying this alone, and I think she's forgotten how many people she's touched." The responses came back immediately and overwhelmingly. Jessica Martinez, who Maya had helped get into Columbia University, offered to drive down from New York. David Chun, now a sophomore at Berkeley, wanted to write a letter about how Maya's creative writing class had changed his relationship with words. Mrs. Patel from their apartment building remembered how Maya had sat with her elderly mother during her last days, reading poetry aloud, in both English and Hindi. Arjun's coworker, Priya, helped him coordinate the logistics. "You're either completely brilliant or completely insane," she told him as they planned the timing. "Maybe both." The most surprising response came from Maya's sister, Kavya, who lived in Chicago and hadn't spoken to Maya in over a year following some family disagreement Arjun had never fully understood. "I've been wanting to reach out," Kavya admitted during their phone call. "I just didn't know how. This gives me a reason." By Saturday, Arjun had received 47 letters, emails, and voice recordings. People shared memories of Maya staying late to help them understand Shakespeare, of her bringing homemade soup when they were sick, of her fierce advocacy for students others had written off. Reading their words, Arjun realized he was discovering new dimensions of his wife's impact, layers of her generosity that she had never mentioned. On Sunday evening, while Maya slept off the exhaustion from a particularly difficult flare-up, Arjun began transforming their living room. He strung lights across the walls and hung photographs, pictures he had secretly gathered from Maya's teaching colleagues, images of her with students at graduation ceremonies, candid shots of her laughing. During faculty meetings, each letter and note was carefully placed, creating a constellation of love that filled every surface. Kavya had driven through the night from Chicago, arriving with a photo album of their childhood and tears in her eyes. "I forgot how much she means to people," she whispered as she helped Arjun arrange the final pieces. As Monday's sunrise crept through their windows, Arjun looked around their transformed apartment and felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Maya would be home from her doctor's appointment soon, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't afraid of what came next. Threads of light. Maya fumbled with her keys at the apartment door, her hands still shaking slightly from the steroid injection Dr. Chun had administered that afternoon. The new medication regimen felt overwhelming: pills for inflammation, vitamins for deficiencies, warnings about side effects that seemed worse than her current symptoms. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal door, gathering the energy to face another evening of Arjun's worried glances and careful conversations around the elephant that had taken residence in their home. The key finally turned, and Maya stepped inside, immediately noticing that something was different. The usual afternoon light filtering through their windows seemed warmer, more golden, and there was a subtle humming in the air, not mechanical, but alive somehow. She dropped her purse and froze. Tiny white lights cascaded from their ceiling, like gentle rain, creating pools of soft illumination throughout their living room. But it wasn't the lights that made her knees buckle, it was everything else. Photographs covered every wall, dozens of them, showing faces she recognized from years of teaching, moments she had forgotten, smiles she had helped create. "What is this?" she whispered to the empty air, taking tentative steps forward. A handwritten note taped to their coffee table caught her eye, written in the careful cursive of her former student, Amanda Torres. "Ms. Maya, you probably don't remember, but you stayed after school every Tuesday for 3 months to help me with my college essay. I got into Northwestern because of you. I'm a journalist now, and every story I write carries a piece of what you taught me about finding truth in words." Maya's hands trembled as she picked up another note, this one from Marcus Williams. "You made me read The House on Mango Street when I was failing sophomore English. You said Esperanza reminded you of me, someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere. I understood what you meant when I became the first person in my family to graduate college. Thank you for seeing me before I saw myself." She moved through the room like someone in a dream, discovering letter after letter, each one a thread connecting her to a life she thought Lupus had erased. There was a drawing from little Aisha next door, showing Maya watering her herb garden with a giant smile. A photo from last year's senior prom, where she had chaperoned and spent the evening dancing awkwardly with students who had insisted she join them. Maya. She turned to find Arjun standing in their bedroom doorway, his expression tender and uncertain. He looked different somehow, not the careful, walking on eggshells version of himself he had become over the past month, but the man she had married, the one who used to surprise her with midnight ice cream runs and handwritten love notes tucked into her lunch bag. "How did you?" she began, but her voice broke. "The medical bill came last Tuesday," he said simply, stepping closer. "Lupus." Maya's face crumpled with shame. "I'm sorry. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to tell anyone." "Look around," Arjun said gently, gesturing to the transformed room. "Look at what you've built. Look at who you are." Maya turned back to the walls of memories, seeing them now with different eyes. Here was Mrs. Rodriguez from the grocery store, thanking her for helping translate at parent-teacher conferences. There was a video message from her college roommate, recalling how Maya had talked her through her first panic attack. Even her estranged sister Kavya had sent a photo of them as children, with a note that simply read, "I'm sorry it took me so long to remember what matters." "You spent 3 weeks pulling yourself apart," Arjun continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "So I spent 3 weeks putting you back together with help from everyone who loves you." Maya sank onto their couch, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what surrounded her. She had been so focused on what Lupus was taking away that she had forgotten what remained: the countless moments of connection, the lives she had touched, the love that existed independent of her health. "I was so scared," she admitted, looking up at Arjun through tears. "I thought Lupus meant I couldn't be the person you married anymore. Arjun sat beside her, finally close enough to touch. He took her hands in his, and for the first time in weeks she didn't pull away. "You're right," he said, and Maya's heart lurched until he continued. "You can't be exactly the same person I married. But Maya, look around this room. Look at 47 people who are telling you that the person you are lupus, and all is worth celebrating. You're not the same, and that's okay. We'll figure out who you are now, together." Maya leaned into his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the faint smell of tape and paper from his secret project. For the first time since Dr. Chan's diagnosis, she felt like she might be able to imagine a future that included both her disease and her dreams. "I love you," she whispered into the golden light of their transformed home. "I love you too," he replied. "All of you. Every version of you we're going to discover." New beginnings. 6 months later, Maya stood in the community center on Maple Street, arranging folding chairs in a circle, while Arjun hung a banner that read, "Thrive Together. Young Adults Living with Chronic Illness." The spring afternoon light filtered through tall windows, and Maya paused to appreciate how different her relationship with sunlight had become. She still wore long sleeves and SPF 50, but fear had gradually transformed into careful respect. 5 minutes until people start. Arriving, Arjun called from across the room, stepping down from the ladder. He had become her partner in ways she never could have imagined, not just as a husband, but as a co-facilitator, a researcher of treatment options, and her anchor during the difficult days that still came with unpredictable frequency. Maya smoothed the pages of her notebook, where she had written discussion topics and resource lists. Teaching had taken on a new form now. She had returned to Jefferson High School part-time, with accommodations that allowed for rest periods and flexible scheduling during flare-ups. But this support group had become her passion project, born from the realization that chronic illness in your 20s and 30s carried unique challenges that existing resources rarely addressed. The first person through the door was Elena, a 28-year-old marketing executive with rheumatoid arthritis who had found them through an online forum. She was followed by Marcus, not her former student, but a different Marcus, a 26-year-old with Crohn's disease who worked as a graphic designer and spoke eloquently about the intersection of chronic pain and creative work. "How are you feeling today?" Maya asked each person as they settled into the circle, a question that had taken on profound meaning in her new vocabulary. Not, "How are you?" with its expectation of fine, but "How are you feeling?" with its acknowledgement that feelings could be complex, contradictory, and change from hour to hour. "Frustrated," admitted Sarah, a 31-year-old teacher with fibromyalgia. "I had to cancel dinner with friends again last night because I couldn't get out of bed. I feel like I'm disappearing from my own social life." Maya nodded, remembering her own months of isolation. "I used to think that having lupus meant I had to choose between being honest about my limitations and maintaining relationships. What I learned is that the right people, the people worth keeping, want honesty more than they want perfection." "But how do you find those people?" Ask James, who was newly diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at 29. "How do you know who's going to stick around when things get complicated?" Arjun, who had taken his usual seat slightly outside the circle, but close enough to offer support, spoke up. "Sometimes you don't find them. Sometimes they find you." Maya spent weeks convinced that her diagnosis made her less worthy of love. But the people who truly knew her, students, colleagues, neighbors, they reminded her of who she had always been. Maya smiled at her husband, remembering the transformed living room that had changed everything. That evening 6 months ago had become a turning point, not because it erased her struggles with lupus, but because it provided a foundation of love from which to rebuild. "I brought something to share today," said Elena, pulling out her phone. I started documenting my good days, not just the symptom-free days, but the days when I felt present in my life, despite the pain. I wanted to share some photos. The group leaned in as Elena showed images. Herself painting despite swollen joints, a dinner she had cooked for friends with dietary accommodations, a hiking trail she had tackled at her own pace, with frequent rest stops. "This is what I've learned," Maya said, looking around the circle of faces that had become familiar over the past 3 months. "Chronic illness doesn't pause your life. It changes the rhythm. We get to decide what that new rhythm looks like." After the group ended and they were stacking chairs, Arjun approached Maya with an envelope. "This came for you today," he said, his expression curious. Inside was a letter from Dr. Chun's office, but not the usual appointment reminder or test results. Instead, it was a note from Dr. Chun herself. "Maya, I heard about your support group through the hospital's patient services department. I wanted you to know that several of my other young patients have asked about resources like what you're providing. Would you be interested in discussing ways we could collaborate?" Maya looked up at Arjun, who was grinning. "You know what this means?" "That maybe lupus didn't end my story," Maya said slowly. "Maybe it just gave me a different one to tell." As they walked to their car, Maya felt the familiar afternoon fatigue setting in, a reminder that her body still required careful attention and respect. But alongside the tiredness was something else, a sense of purpose that felt both new and deeply familiar, like coming home to a version of herself she was still discovering. "Same time next week?" Arjun asked, starting the car. "Same time next week," Maya confirmed, already thinking about the topics they would explore, the connections they would nurture, and the lives they would continue to rebuild together, not in spite of chronic illness, but in creative partnership with it.